Well, yeah, actually I went to school here at ASU many years ago and really enjoyed my experience and loved the mountains and decided to stay. It's such a wonderful place.
Eustace Conway has long been celebrated as a man who defied the modern world, a figure who chose isolation, endurance, and the raw challenges of nature over comfort and convenience. To millions, he represents freedom and resilience, but behind that public image lies a private story known only to his family. Recently, they spoke out, revealing the moments of fear, uncertainty, and heartbreak that accompanied his life deep in the wilderness. These were not adventures captured for television cameras, but experiences that tested both Eustace and those who loved him most. For years, his family endured long stretches without word, watching the skies for storms, imagining the dangers he might face, and carrying a quiet, constant anxiety that only grew with time. The wilderness demanded everything from him: physical stamina, mental fortitude, and relentless self-reliance, but it also exacted a toll on the family waiting at home. When they finally shared the truth, there were tears, silences, and stories that had been held for years. This revelation was not about blame or dramatization. It was about understanding the cost of a life lived on the edge, where survival and love intersected in ways few could imagine. What happened deep in the wilderness would forever change the family's perception of strength, sacrifice, and the ties that bind. Long before cameras followed Eustace Conway into the wilderness, he was already living a life few could comprehend. From an early age, he rejected modern comforts, believing that civilization dulled the human spirit, while others built careers, homes, and predictable lives. Eustace sought something far more demanding: a complete immersion into nature. His family watched this journey with a mixture of pride, fascination, and growing concern. They admired his courage and discipline, but they also feared the consequences of a life defined by isolation and constant challenge. As Eustace ventured deeper into the wilderness, communication became rare. Letters went unanswered for weeks, phone calls were missed, and every day without news increased the tension at home. His family learned to live with this uncertainty, measuring time not by hours or days, but by stretches of silence that carried heavy worry. They understood his choices intellectually, but emotionally, the distance took a toll. Storms that might have seemed trivial to ordinary observers became sources of terror. They imagined him navigating freezing rain, snow-packed forests, and rugged terrain with limited supplies and no one to rely on but himself. Each imagined scenario brought sleepless nights, frantic calls to friends, and an undercurrent of helplessness that gnawed at them silently. When Eustace returned, he often downplayed injuries, fatigue, or illness. Pain to him was a teacher. To his family, it was a warning. They noticed changes in his appearance, subtle signs of strain that he refused to acknowledge. Emotional distance mirrored the physical separation. Family gatherings became awkward, conversations stilted, and moments together fleeting. The wilderness, in its raw demands, had created a chasm that admiration and love alone could not bridge. Yet despite the fear, they remained proud. Pride and anxiety coexisted uneasily, a constant reminder that loving someone like Eustace required endurance. They knew his life was not just a choice. It was an identity, one that carried consequences for everyone connected to him. Beneath the admiration, the family carried a quiet dread, an unspoken fear that the wilderness could one day take him further than anyone could follow. Still, Eustace's family never gave up hope. They supported his philosophy of self-reliance even as it frightened them, recognizing that the man they loved was shaped by the very challenges that terrified them. They lived each day in a careful balance of pride, fear, and unwavering devotion, fully aware that one misstep in the wild could forever change their lives. This tension between independence and connection defined their world. It was a test not only of Eustace's endurance, but of the family's ability to cope with uncertainty. The wilderness had become more than a landscape. It was a proving ground, not just for survival, but for love, resilience, and the bonds that hold people together even across impossible distances. And as they waited for his return time and again, they learned that admiration could coexist with fear, and that the price of freedom often exacted the deepest emotional cost. The wilderness has a way of testing limits that no preparation can fully anticipate. And for Eustace Conway, that test arrived suddenly. with consequences that shook both him and his family. On what began as a routine expedition, conditions shifted unexpectedly. Storms rolled in faster than anticipated, temperatures dropped, and familiar paths became treacherous. Eustace was isolated in a way he had never truly experienced before, and the challenges of survival, food, shelter, and safety became immediate, pressing concerns. Back home, the anxiety that had long been part of his family's life intensified. Days passed without word. Weeks of silence stretched painfully long. Each unreturned message or missed check-in heightened their fear. They retraced maps in their minds, tried to anticipate where he might be, and silently hoped that he was taking precautions they could not oversee. The uncertainty was crushing. They had always understood the risks of his chosen life, but this felt different. Every moment without confirmation of his safety amplified a primal dread that had quietly lived in the background for years. When Eustace finally emerged, the relief was immense, but the visible toll of the experience was undeniable. He was thinner, bruised, and weary in a way that no one could ignore. He spoke little of the events, masking the depth of what had occurred. But his family could see it in his posture, his eyes, and the quiet weight he carried. The wilderness had tested him beyond physical limits, and he had returned forever changed. Fragments of the ordeal later emerged. Critical supplies had dwindled. Natural shelters failed during violent storms, and injuries had forced him to endure pain without assistance. At one point, he reportedly realized how close he had come to disaster, a recognition that shook the very core of his belief in absolute self-reliance. For someone who built his identity on independence and resilience, this moment was both humbling and transformative. The emotional impact on his family was profound. Seeing the man they admired so deeply return, visibly affected and vulnerable, stirred a complex mixture of relief, fear, and grief. They confronted the reality that the life he had chosen for himself came with consequences that touched them as intimately as it touched him. Their conversations after his return were marked by tears, silence, and cautious dialogue. It was the first time they spoke openly about the fear and exhaustion they had endured in his absence. It was not blame they expressed, but truth, the emotional cost of loving someone who consistently placed themselves in danger. For Eustace, this period became a turning point. He began to acknowledge the weight of his choices and the ripple effects they had on those closest to him. Survival, he realized, was not merely about enduring the harshness of nature, but about recognizing the human connections that make enduring meaningful. This insight did not diminish his spirit. It tempered it, bringing a depth of awareness that had been absent before. The family's experience during this crisis revealed the unspoken sacrifices of those who love adventurers. While Eustace navigated storms, injuries, and isolation, they navigated uncertainty, anxiety, and fear. Both endured, both grew, and both emerged with a renewed understanding of the delicate balance between independence and connection. The wilderness had tested more than survival. It had tested love, patience, and the capacity to bear invisible burdens together. The return from that harrowing experience did not mark the end of challenges for Eustace Conway or his family. While he physically recovered, the emotional landscape had shifted in ways that could not be ignored. Eustace, once confident and almost untouchable in his independence, began to show signs of reflection. There was a quiet humility in his demeanor, a subtle recognition that the wilderness could no longer be taken for granted. His family noticed this change immediately. The stories of survival were still told, but they were tempered with caution, awareness, and respect for the limits that nature imposed. This period became a time for reconnection. Conversations that had previously skirted difficult truths were now unavoidable. His family shared the nights spent awake in worry, the mental calculations of where he might be, and the silent prayers offered for his safety. They recounted the emotional strain, the fear, and the helplessness that accompanied his prolonged absences. These moments were not about reproach. They were about honesty, laying bare the often invisible toll that extreme independence exacts on those who love fiercely. Eustace listened in ways he had not before. He did not deflect, argue, or rationalize. Instead, he absorbed the impact of his choices. Guilt was present, not for living his beliefs, but for underestimating the anxiety and pain his absence caused. This awareness marked a turning point in his approach to both life and relationships. Trust, long strained by distance and silence, began to be rebuilt. Simple gestures, messages confirming safety, updates during extended absences, or brief phone calls became profound expressions of care and connection. The wilderness itself began to take on a new meaning. No longer merely a proving ground, it became a teacher of balance. Eustace spoke less about conquering ailments and more about respect, preparation, and mindfulness. His family witnessed a man who could still endure incredible physical challenges, but now did so with a consciousness that his survival mattered to more than just himself. They understood that strength was no longer measured by isolation or endurance alone, but by the ability to protect connections and acknowledge vulnerability. The emotional lessons were perhaps even more significant than the physical ones. The family realized that their love required resilience, patience, and an acceptance that fear is a natural companion when someone you care for lives on the edge. They also saw that Eustace's survival was inseparable from the bonds he maintained at home. The wilderness could test his body and mind, but the strength of human connection sustained his spirit in ways no solitude could replicate. Through this process, the family's bond with Eustace grew stronger. They learned that fear and admiration can coexist, that love is both patient and persistent, and that true resilience is as much about emotional endurance as it is about physical survival. Eustace's experiences in the wilderness became a mirror reflecting not only his courage but also the devotion, worry, and unwavering support of those waiting for him. The lessons were hard-won but enduring, reshaping their understanding of freedom, responsibility, and what it truly means to survive together. In the end, this period of reflection and reconnection did more than heal wounds. It reinforced the idea that survival is a shared journey. The wilderness had tested Eustace in every conceivable way, but it had also reminded the family that endurance is never solitary. Strength is measured not only by how one withstands adversity, but also by the care, understanding, and love that endure alongside it. Today, Eustace Conway's story is often told as a tale of extreme independence, survival, and the untamed wilderness. Yet the full story extends far beyond the mountains and forests he calls home. It lies in the emotional journey of the family who watched from afar, the silent witnesses to the risks, and the unseen consequences of a life lived on the edge. The family's recent revelations provide a rare glimpse into the human cost behind the legend, reminding the world that every act of courage is mirrored by the concern of those who love deeply. What happened during that perilous expedition reshaped not only Eustace's perspective but also the dynamics within his family. They learned that strength is not measured solely by endurance, but by the capacity to connect, to communicate, and to acknowledge the impact of one's choices on others. Eustace continued his life in the wilderness, but now he did so with an understanding that survival involves more than physical prowess. Emotional awareness, respect for limitations, and consideration for those waiting at home became as critical as firewood, water, and shelter. The family's experience underscores an essential truth: the wilderness is unforgiving. Yet it is the bonds between people that provide resilience beyond any environmental challenge. Their tears, their sleepless nights, and their quiet anxiety were not signs of weakness, but of profound love. They waited, worried, and hoped, embodying a different kind of courage, one that often goes unseen. Through this lens, the story of Eustace Conway is not only about the man in the wild, but about the enduring strength of family, love, and connection in the face of uncertainty. Rebuilding trust and communication became central to their lives. Simple gestures, a timely message, a brief phone call, a signal of safety became monumental, symbolizing respect, responsibility, and care. These small acts reflected a newfound balance between independence and relational awareness, proving that survival is as much about sustaining human connections as it is about enduring physical hardship. Ultimately, the wilderness tested more than Eustace's skills. It tested the family's resilience, patience, and capacity to endure unseen struggles. Yet, through adversity, they discovered that survival is a shared experience. The wilderness shaped Eustace, but it also revealed the unwavering devotion of those who loved him. Their story demonstrates that courage is not measured solely by solitude or bravery in isolation, but by the willingness to wait, to hope, And to support someone navigating the edge between life and danger. The lessons from this experience resonate far beyond the forests. They remind us that strength exists in many forms: physical, mental, and emotional. True survival is not a solitary pursuit, but a shared journey, anchored by relationships that endure through fear, uncertainty, and distance. Eustace Conway's life in the wilderness remains extraordinary, but it is the family's love, patience, and unwavering support that give his story its deepest meaning. In the end, what the wilderness tests most profoundly is not just the body, but the heart, and it is love above all that sustains us through the most unforgiving challenges.